Hello, today we're going to be taking a look at the Segotep 1250 watt power supply for your desktop computer. This is I believe, a fully modular design. So without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, okay. I was wondering. I was like, wow, this is some plastic, some cardboard. This doesn't seem that high quality. And then, that's more like Segotep Professional Fully Modular PSU. For gamers, I don't think it makes much of a difference, though this is the enthusiast level power supply, so gamers probably the only ones that are going to be using it. Probably a new power supply we can use for our testing too. More plastic. And more cardboard. We just go plastic, cardboard, plastic, cardboard. So this is 1250 watts, which is basically what you need to run any of the modern high-end graphics cards. Let's see. Here's the baggie. Now, interestingly enough, I do have larger power supplies. I have an EVGA, I think 1300 watt. However, this one, given its size, etc., it is, I mean wattage. The size itself is not that bad. The EVGA one is actually much longer, and this is relatively standard, especially the amount of power that it's packing. Components all look like they're in there relatively well. No rattles, which is good. Though, to be 100% honest, it just, for some reason, strikes me as just being... I want to say it's just very different than like the EVGA power supplies that I've worked with before or dealt with before. Everything's fully modular. Looks very nice. Let's check out our cables. So, especially when you're paying, I believe this is a $200 power supply, believe it or not. Well, at least you get the jumper to test it with. But some things that I guess to point out is, number one, braided cables. EVGA definitely has braided cables for, I guess we have cable ties. So braided cables are a little bit nicer to have, especially, at this size. So speaking of which, what can we run on this sucker? So you have 6 SATA 6-pin connectors, and then 6 8-pin PCIe connectors, and then the motherboard connector, as well as 2 CPU connectors. We also don't have an SN code on the side here. It's just flat. So what do we get? Well, we get some cable ties, the jumper connector, power cord, which, I mean, respect where respect is given. This is a rather beefy power cord because this is a rather beefy power supply. Yeah, I don't see any issues there. So let me throw it in the system and we'll get testing it out. So I finished building this computer over here with the power supply. Now, I have some final concluding thoughts. First of those is, of course, that this power supply does something that very few power supplies do, and that is allow you to slide the connectors for the graphics card, the CPU, the motherboard connector. All of those connectors allow you to slide in the pieces. Now, usually with like PCIe cables, you'll have a separate optional 2-pin connector that you can add in for a 6-pin connector to get your 8-pin that you might need for regular graphics cards. And this power supply does it spot on. You slide them in together and they plug in and they don't go everywhere. For example, EVGA power supplies, you have to kind of like hold them together and then like try to plug it in. It's very frustrating. So this power supply, while it may not be powder coated or anything like that, or maybe not have braided cables, it is very, very nice. That is extremely nice when you're plugging in stuff. It's a lot of headache. Speaking of the braided cables though, if you're going for aesthetics, it does call into question, most power supplies around this range have, some type of powder coating and some type of braided cables or something a little bit different than just regular cables. So makes you wonder if they cheaped out there. Where else have they cheaped out? I don't think there was any issues, no issues with testing the system. But for the most part, it makes you wonder, especially with, I'll take the connectors over braided cables in my opinion, but a lot of people like that look, and it does make it look a little bit nicer in my opinion. So overall, would I buy this power supply and compared with some of the stuff we've reviewed on this channel? For example, the EVGA 1300, G2 1300, or the Be Quiet 1000 watt. There's a couple other power supplies we reviewed on here. And to be honest with you, this falls interestingly in that range. So, compared to power supplies within that price range, right around the $250 price range, this is $208. It comes in at the lower end of the price, which would make sense why, the cables are not braided. While, honestly, in my opinion, I think I would rather sacrifice the braided cables for testing, of course, the power supply. Now, during stress tests, these are awfully boring stress tests. Didn't have any issues. The power supply didn't cut off. Nothing out of the normal. Basic, fan was quiet. No noticeable noise. So for the most part, I have no issues except with like stuff that you physically can see. That the fact that, as I said, no braided cables and no powder coating. But obviously, since this is priced almost $50 less than the 1300 watt stuff, it is 50 watts less, but that's kind of irrelevant. It makes sense, what you're seeing. So if that stuff is important to you, then yeah, get the higher end model. If you were going for looks, you could always buy more cables. Of course, that will end up, you could buy braided cables, and that, of course, will be more expensive than just buying an EVGA power supply. So overall, what I recommend, if that's what your price range is limited to, $200 is still a lot for a power supply. I remember my graphics cards were like $300, so definitely could consider this, especially if that's kind of what you need for the high-end graphics cards. So thank you very much for tuning in for this review, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and check out the channel for other cool related tech reviews and unboxings. Goodbye. So I forgot to mention with the power supply, I was talking a lot about the EVGA power supply. And that's not entirely correct or honest, because I forgot to include another important key detail when it comes to power supplies. That is, the EVGA power supply that was $250, $60 that I was comparing it to has one major downside. This power supply, the one by Segotep, does an exceptional job at keeping everything in a standard form factor. That means that this power supply is no different than a 650 watt in size. The EVGA power supplies that, while they may have their cables wrapped and they may be powder coated, are long. And that means that when you're trying to fit them in a case, it is sometimes impossible, because cases are not designed, especially some of them, are not designed with long power supplies in mind. This is a standard power supply. This will fit anywhere that any standard ATX power supply will fit. And that is something to keep in mind, is that sometimes when you buy these large power supplies, they like to make them longer and don't tell you about it. So in this case, size does matter.